Welcome, and I want to thank everyone for having the confidence in me to listen to what I have to say, and I hope the presentation will fulfill your expectations. This presentation is in honor of the memory of my wife, Evelyn, alav shalom, and also in zecher the yortzeit of my father-in-law, Harav Yeshaya Yitzchak ben Harav Yisrael Yechiel Halevi, Rabbi Shaya Black. I want to thank Rabbi Hyman for his graciousness in allowing me to make this presentation. And a special thank you to Rabbi Ken Green, my friend, for providing me with additional source materials. I also want to thank the Men's Club for co-sponsoring this lecture. First, a disclaimer. This topic is controversial. There are many who do not agree with my conclusions or my reasoning. For example, there is a rabbi in Jerusalem, genuine Talmud Chacham, Maggid Shir, Rabbi Eliezer Parkov. Rabbi Parkov does not agree with me. He is adamant against my conclusion. Nevertheless, it does not affect our friendship. We have known each other for more than 30 years. He is a friend. He often sees my son and tells him, please give my warm regards to your father. When I wrote a Sefer Torah for my 80th birthday, he was one of the first people to come and put letters into the Sefer Torah. The analogy I draw is the Gemara story of the Talmidim of Psil and Shammai. They fought hard in the Beis Medrash, but their children married each other, and that's how it should be. You see a small Jewish boy, maybe he's still in short pants, walking down the street. The boy is wearing his tzitzis outside of his pants. The street could be anywhere. Mea Shearim or Monsey, West Hempstead or Williamsburg, Borough Park or Beit Shemesh, Geula or Golders Green. If you were to ask him, why is he wearing his tzitzis outside of his pants? He might answer, this is the way my mother dresses me. Or, I have an older brother. He does this, so I do this. Or, my father tells me this is what I have to dress like. If he's a little bit older, maybe has a little bit of experience and education, he might add that in Pasha Shlach, in the Pasha about tzitzis, it says it should be seen, and this is how it should be seen. The first three answers are okay. They're satisfactory. The last one is not correct. There are a number of mefarshim and sources that say that before the word Uri Isem is printed, before that, the pasuk says Psil Techeles, it's a positive commandment. And the Isem refers to the contrast between the blue fringe or the blue thread, however you want to translate it, and the white threads. In fact, the Gemara has a question, what about tzitzis that are all white or all blue? Are they halachically correct? So they refer to the blue contrast, the blue of the sky, the blue of the sea. Those are the analogies. There is no doubt that our ancestors wore tefillin. They wore Psil Techeles. When you look at archaeological discoveries in Qumran and Mesorah and other places in Eretz Yisrael, you see ancient clothing. On the edges of the clothing, you have fringes. One of the fringes is blue. There's a professor in Haifa, in Shenka College, who took the blue, extracted it from one of the gold strings, and created a DNA patch to match against what he thinks is the current thinking about the actual source of the text. So why did we stop? There's a one-word answer. That word is Rome. A brief history. Rome came to the east. First they came as diplomats, and then as friends, and then they brought their soldiers, their culture, their architecture, their games, their gods. And eventually our ancestors rebelled against Rome. And finally, the Roman 10th Legion came, laid waste to the city of Jerusalem, tore down the Bayis Sheni, the second temple, and everything was stopped. Less than a century later, in another revolution against the Romans, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, again, Rome put down the rebellion with great cruelty. And they made Israel our ancient land and the residents there, our ancient ancestors. They stopped them from having Shabbos, from having Milah, from Shchita. They stopped them from producing Techeles. Rome forbade Jews from following many of their religious customs and laws, and they stopped the production of the dyes. In fact, there's a Roman historian in the 2nd and 3rd centuries who mentions the names of several Roman families who were dyers. They made the blue and the purple. The blue was the color of the Roman Senate, the members of the Senate, their families and retinue. The purple, or agramon, was the color of the Roman emperor, his family, his retinue. And they were very wealthy, these families, because if you knew how to make dyes in the ancient world, you were a wealthy person. So they stopped the production of the Techeles by the Jews, but the Romans continued it because they wanted the dyes. After a few centuries, the Gemara talks about the Menuchos, has a discussion about tzitzis. How should it be worn? How should it be affixed to the garment? How many knots? How many strings? And in passing, almost in passing, they mention that the source of the blue, the source of the Techeles, is the chilozone. Now, they don't describe the chilozone, they just mention the word. Now, if I were to tell you that I was at the zoo the other day and I saw a lion, I wouldn't have to tell you that the lion has 4 legs, and it's a large predator, and it's a feline, and it's got a tail. And that, you already have in your mind, you know what the chilozone looks like. You know what the lion looks like. The Amoraim knew what the chilozone looked like. In fact, in Gemara Shabbos, when they mention that, is it permissible on Shabbos to crack the shell of a chilozone? And if you do, are you liable for any penalty? Well, they knew what a chilozone was, but gradually it became part of the distant past. And in the academies of Surah and Pamadisa, they discussed tzitzis, they discussed the commandment of tzitzis, but soon enough, they lost the essence of the chilozone, what it was and how the Techeles was produced. And how the strings are tied and how they're produced are discussed by Amran Gon, Dajagon, the Rambam, the Ravid, Rashi, and Tosfos. There are references to this, to the discussion in the Rif, Rabbi Yitzhak Al-Fazi of the Rosh, Rabbi Ina Asher, his son Yaakov, who we know is the Torah. They all discuss the concept of tzitzis, the mitzvah of tzitzis, but nobody's talking about how it's made and how it's produced. Gradually, they came to the understanding that they don't really know, so they don't really agree to reinstitute this Mesorah. And they say, we've lost the Mesorah, we won't recover it until Mashiach. Until the 19th century. The 19th century, Rabbi Gershon Henechlina, the Regina Rebbe, publishes a pamphlet, and he asserts that the chilozone is the cuttlefish. He is challenged by the Beis Halevi, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, who writes in Techeles. This is not Techeles. He contrasts the conclusions by Rabbi Lina. He rejects them. If you think that the Beis Halevi is rejectionist on all things, then I charge you to look at the Sefer Beis Halevi on the Rambam. Look at his interesting analysis of Hilchos Rotzach of Shmiras Nefesh, life and death. Very interesting. In the 20th century, Rabbi Isaac Herzog, around 1913, publishes his PhD thesis. And his PhD thesis is on the sea snail, the Murex or the Hexaplex trunculus, a sea snail which he claims is the source of Techeles. He takes Rabbi Lena's conclusions, analyzes them, rejects them, that it's not the cuttlefish, it's the sea snail, and that's how the system works. After the establishment of Israel, further discoveries are made concerning the Techeles, and that's how it stands until this day. There are people who say we lost the Mesorah, and we have to wait till Mashiach. We don't know what it is, and that's it. Some 30 years ago, I theorized that if there were ancient Jewish communities whose lands never were conquered by Rome, and as a result, never lost the Mesorah, do these communities ever still have or had still Techeles when Rome never stopped them from producing it. Each of the following Jewish communities that I'm going to discuss is of ancient origin, has a strong rabbinic foundation, has a living tradition with a strong rabbinic past. And that's the essence of this presentation. I discovered during more than 30 years of research 3 such communities. 2 I'm pretty positive of, the 3rd I speculate. And these are the discoveries that I made. The first are the Jews of Yemen, where my wife and I were members of the Bet Knesset HaNasi, which is also called the Mesorah in Jerusalem, where I sit in shul usually. In back of me, 2 rows back, is Nisan Edry. Nisan Edry was born in Yemen. He and his brother both said to me on more than one occasion, they remember as children in Yemen, their father and their uncles all wore tails. We had it. We knew how to do it. We made it. Very interesting. A number of years ago, the Mossad, Israel Secret Service, bribed a colonel in the Yemenite army to give visas to Yemenite families that wanted to escape from Yemen on one condition: they could not go to Eretz Yisrael. So the Mossad set up a program, a strategy, where they would get their visas. They would come to the United States, where they would wait until they had made contact with their families who were living in Eretz Yisrael, and then fly them secretly to Eretz Yisrael. That was the plan. They knew that they could not do this in New York City. Somebody would find out and the whole scheme would collapse. So they looked around and they found a small, unincorporated village outside of New York City, West Hempstead, New York. At the time that this happened, I was the first vice president of the University of West Hempstead. My wife and I were living there. I was also the executive vice president of the local yeshiva, the Hebrew Academy in Nassau County, known colloquially as HANC. And they came to me and they said, we need to find a house, quiet side street, where the Yemenite families could stay while they were in the United States. And the advantage was that West Hempstead is about 20 minutes from Kennedy Airport. At the time of night, they could take these families, drive them to Kennedy Airport, put them on a LL plane, and fly them directly to Israel. One night, Friday night, as I was leaving the shul and I was walking with a young man, Larry Posen, we saw coming toward us a group of Yemenites who had just arrived from Yemen and were staying in the house in West Hempstead. Led by a tall man with a dabiya, a Yemenite overcoat, a Yemenite turban, long white, yellow, gray, yellow, white beard. And he's wearing silk tailors. So in my best interpretation of a Sephardi accent, I said to him, Shabbat Shalom. He froze. He stopped. He looked at me. He stared at me. And then after a few seconds, he walked on further. Didn't know what happened. My neighbor across the street, we lived on Roosevelt Boulevard. My neighbor across the street, whose daughter Yasmin once babysat for us, was actually the head of the Mossad, the head of the Tzidkaya program. His cover was that he owned a restaurant in the 5 towns. They made the most delicious Turkish salad. We used to buy it before Shabbos. It was delicious. He stops me on the street. He said, Isaac, you don't know what you did. What did I do? He said, you stopped and then tells me the name of the person and you wish them a Shabbat Shalom. So, he said, you don't understand. If a Jew stopped another Jew on the street in Yemen and spoke to him in Yiddish, in Hebrew, both the person who spoke Hebrew and the person to whom the Hebrew was spoken might be executed by the Yemenite secret police. I didn't realize that this man thought that I was putting him in danger. Oi! Can you imagine? When the families came to West Hempstead, we took their children and put them into school. They came to Hank. I remember the boys and the girls, the girls with their long stockings, the boys with their kayas flying, their tzitzis with Techeles coming into school. They only spoke Hebrew and Arabic. Of course, in 2 weeks, they were learning a little bit of English and wearing backpacks that we bought for them and going to school. So the children were wearing Techeles. In Rosh Ha'ayin, which is a city in Israel, which has a large Yemenite population, when my wife was the president of Amit, we used to visit the Amit schools all over the country. And I remember once we went to an Amit high school in Rosh Ha'ayin, and I asked a girl there, does she know the difference between a gimel and a dalet with or without a dagesh, which we call a dagesh tal? Because the Yemenites knew how to pronounce this. Another Mesorah that they never lost, that we in the West didn't know. And she said, I don't know, but that boy, and she's pointing to a boy near her, he just came from Yemen last week. Ask him. So I asked this boy in Hebrew, and he said, sure, a gimel with a dagesh is a gimel, without it's a gimel. And the dalet without a dagesh is a dalet. Now, those two pronunciations correspond to the Arabic letters, which also change form when they have a dagesh, whether it's in the middle of the word, the beginning of the word, or the end of the word. So the Yemenites did not lose the Mesorah of the Techeles. They did not lose the Mesorah of knowing how to pronounce these letters and these words in Hebrew. In fact, when my friend Nisan Edry learns from the Torah in our shul, you can hear his Yemenite accent and his pronunciation of the letters. So there's no doubt in my mind that the Jews of Yemen never lost the Mesorah. The second community are the Jews of Kerala. Kerala is the name of the state in southwest India. From the time of Shlomo HaMelech, our ancestors made boats and sailed from the southern port of Etzion Geber around the Horn of the Arabian Peninsula, all the way to the east, and settled in places like Navgoin, Alibag, and Kochi. Those areas became very well populated with Jewish merchants who were building communities there. In fact, in Navgoin, there's a tradition that two of their ships crashed into the rocks off the Arabian Sea, and they used the timber from those boats to build their first homes. And the Jews were always accepted in India. It's amazing that, because I imagine when the Jews first came, they met local people, and the people that they met were of a polyglot, different religions: Buddhist, Hindu, Jain. You ever hear of Jain? You know of the religion Jain? There are 10 million adherents in India. Or Sikh. In fact, there's a picture that I made, which shows me with 3 different members of the Indian army. One is a Gurkha, one is a Sikh, one is a Brahmin, one is Hindu, one is Buddhist, one is a Sikh. Different religions, they all pet together. They all are one country, one community, one society. So the Jews settled in that area, and they were populous. In fact, they were so populous that a monument exists in Navgoin called the Jerusalem Gate. In Hebrew, on the upper right-hand side, are the words in Hebrew of some 35 different Jewish communities that existed in that area. And inside the Jerusalem Gate is a large, tall pillar upon which is written in Hebrew and in the local language, because India has 15 official languages, the story of 2,000 years of Jewish residency and settlement in the state of Kerala. The Jews in India were successful merchants. In fact, at one time, they controlled the pepper trade. That was important in ancient times because it's a preservative. And there's a place in Kochi. We call these Jews, by the way, Kochini Jews, but that's not what they call themselves. So a typical building in the city of Kochi has a Jewish connotation on it. They've got a Magen David on it. The buildings have mezuzahs in the doorposts. Some of them have the spaces where mezuzah once existed. And in a place called Jewtown on Jew Street, and that's the sign of the signs that we saw, At the end of that Jewtown Road is a Jewish cemetery. The tombs in this Jewish cemetery date back to the 1st century of the Common Era. That's how long there's been a Jewish community there. At the top of the cemetery, of recent vintage, is a wall, a building with a clock in Hebrew, and that's the experience of the Jews in that area. The Jews became so numerous and prosperous that in the 3rd century, the Maharaja gave Yosef Rabban 2 copper plates that authorized him to build an army, collect taxes, run a government. And so there was an independent Jewish state in Kerala for the next 5 centuries. There's a painting in India, it's a very famous painting. The painting of the Maharaja giving the 2 plates to Yosef Rabban, think Rabbi Yosef. And I would tell you the name of the Maharaja, except that it's 15 syllables. It's 13 of which are consonants, 2 are vowels, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce it. There are shuls all over the state of Kerala, old shuls. There were synagogues from the 7th, 9th, 11th, 13th, 15th, and 16th centuries. The latest of those shuls had been restored by the Indian government. It's called the Paradisi Synagogue. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. They take all the tourists to the Paradisi Synagogue. But like all of the other synagogues, the Jews of Cochin built them in a certain fashion. On the 1st floor were benches for the men to sit. In the back of the floor, away from the Aron Kodesh, there are steps leading up to a balcony. In the balcony, there's a desk. That's where they brought the Torah to read. From the balcony, there are additional steps leading up to the women's section. And that's how those synagogues are all built. In fact, the synagogue that the Indian Jews built in the Negev has the same features, looks like the same. And here's a picture of a typical synagogue. This one dates from the 13th century. You can see the balcony where the Torah is read. And this is the guy that told us all about what we were seeing. In back of the balcony is a large storage room. And looking in that storage room, we found evidence of old clothing with Psil Techeles. Now, most of these old synagogues, they don't allow you to go in because they're not safe. But I snuck into the 11th century synagogue, same construction, same place in another city. And here is a picture of the outside. They wouldn't let me take a camera inside. But this too has a balcony and a geniza, or a storage room back, also with proof that these Jews in the 13th century, at least, and the 11th century, had Techeles, those sea snails that they made them from up here in the Indian Ocean, as they do off the Mediterranean coast. And so my conclusion is that the Jews of Kerala also never lost the Mesorah of Techeles, and they had it at least until the 15th or 16th centuries. In the 16th century, or about, they came into contact with another group of Jews who were arriving in India along with the British. And these Jews we call Baghdadi Jews. That's not what they call themselves, but they came from the area of Mesopotamia, currently from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel. And they came with the British. The British were racist. They didn't cotton to the dark-skinned Indian population, but the Baghdadi Jews had light skins. So they convinced the British that they were acceptable and could go into their social clubs to be part of the English society. But they pointed to those Jews from Cochin and they said, they're not real Jews. Look, their skin is much darker. What happened with the Jews that we call Baghdadi Jews is that they became extraordinarily wealthy. Principally among them were 2 families, the Sassoons and the Kaduris. When the British built a railroad throughout India, the most extensive railroad system in the world, the contractors were the Sassoons and the Kaduris. Now, historians may tell you that the Kaduris and Sassoons made their fortune trading opium in the 19th century. But they were far wealthier than that, and they certainly had the wealth before that happened. One of the Sassoons, who was knighted by Queen Victoria, built his own private railroad station. This is the building that he built. That was his station. If you wanted to use his station to take a train anywhere in India, you paid him a fee. Imagine in the United States, people who built railroads, like the Harrimans and the Vanderbilts. The Vanderbilts built Grand Central Station. If everybody used Grand Central Station, I'd pay them a fee. It's a source of wealth. In fact, to this day, the avenue along Grand Central Station is called Vanderbilt Avenue. Well, the Sassoons built this station. When India became independent, they nationalized that as it's the main train station in Mumbai, which used to be called Bombay. When the Jews of Cochin met the Jews of the Baghdadi Jews, they found out that the Jews of Cochin knew everything. The one thing they didn't know about, was Hanukkah, because their arrival in India predated the Hasmonean Revolution against the Greeks. So they had Purim, they didn't have Hanukkah. Historically, that's correct, because Purim events predated the Hanukkah events by several centuries. Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of England, made Queen Victoria the Empress of India. Now, nobody asked the Indians, but nevertheless, she was the Empress. She got money for this. She got her jewels, famous jewels. When she died, her son George became King of England. And in 1905 or thereabouts, he decided to take a trip to visit his territories, the English colonies. He was going to come to India and land in Mumbai, which was then called Bombay. And Sir David Sassoon said, we can't just let the Emperor of India come in ordinarily. So he built the gateway to India, this magnificent monument at the entrance to the harbor of Mumbai to welcome the Emperor of India. And he built it out of his own money. The plaque that's on that monument, if you want to know about a gate being built, think Marble Arch at the beginning of Oxford Street in northwest corner of Hyde Park in London, or the Washington Square Arch in Manhattan, or Grand Army Plaza Arch in Brooklyn. This is double the size of any one of them. And he built it, he paid for it. That was the wealth of that person. In fact, the most famous modern general, military hero in India is General Jack Jacob. General Jack Jacob was an Indian soldier, worked for the British Army during World War II. He was an artillery officer. When India became independent, he joined the Indian Army, rose to become chief of staff. And India and Pakistan have fought 4 wars. In one of the wars, he was the general in charge, built a strategy, and defeated the Pakistani army in 11 days. So 9 million Pakistani Muslim soldiers surrendered to the newish Indian general, Jack Jacob. And the book is called Surrender in Dhaka. It's required reading in schools all across India. And General Jack Jacob is the quintessential English gentleman, lovely person. My wife and I spent hours talking to him. Very nice person, very calm, collected. And he's not only a hero in India, he's a hero in Bangladesh, because his efforts served to separate West Pakistan from East Pakistan. And of course, East Pakistan is today it's called Bangladesh. And he's a hero in Bangladesh history. So the second community that probably did not lose the Mesorah, but continued to have it, are the Jews of Kerala. There's a third community, the Jews in Central Asia around the Aral Sea. We need some history here. The Greek city-states are at war for hundreds of years, called the Peloponnesian Wars. They are finally united by Philip of Macedon. As king, he unites the warring city-state, creates one country, Greece. Philip of Macedon is assassinated. His 20-year-old son, Alexander, becomes king. Alexander's teacher is Aristotle. He's well taught, well educated. Unknown to them at the time, he's also a brilliant military strategist. They study his strategies to this day in military schools. 2 years into his reign, the Greeks who have settled in Asia Minor and built communities there are threatened by the Persian Empire. And so they go to war. Alexander crosses the Dardanelles with 35,000 Greek soldiers, phalanx of Greek soldiers, well trained, according to the historians of the time, and meets a Persian army of some 200,000 people, not only cavalry, but elephants and hangers-on, etc. And in a 2-day battle, the 35,000 Greeks annihilate the Persian army. A historian writing about this about 100 years later says that the Greeks either killed or wounded more than half of the people in the Persian army. The Greeks also capture the Persian king, and suddenly Alexander is sitting at the head of the world. He's the conqueror. Wherever the Greeks went, they built. They brought their science, their art, or architecture. There's hardly a country in that area that doesn't have the ruins, or maybe even well-preserved ruins, of Greek theaters, arenas, municipal buildings, and the like. And Alexander, wherever he goes, he's acknowledged. Not all places is he accepted. One place that he is accepted is in our land, ancient land. The Gemara tells you that Alexander came, met with the Rabbanim, treated them with respect, and as a result, from that day on, Jewish families often name their children Alexander or Alex, because it's after not after any biblical figure or personage, but after Alexander the Great. Alexander continues into Central Asia. He gets as far as the area past the Aral Sea, where there are 2 rivers that meet in a small market town. And there he builds and creates the city of Samarkand. And Jews come with him. Jews come and they settle not only in Samarkand, but in Kivu and in Bukhara. We call these Jews Bukharan Jews. If you want to know how wealthy and how well treated they were in that land, in Kivu, there's a 7th century synagogue still in good condition. Go online and look at it. It's got a beautiful dome. It's in gorgeous shape. It's an example of the Jews that were accepted by the Central Asian Turkish rulers, the Uzbeks. Samarkand is the starting place for the Silk Route, by which trade merchants went from Samarkand all the way to the east of China, back and forth. That was a regular merchant route. Every 7 days, because there were Jews on that merchant trail, a hostel or a place to stop and water your flock and water your horses and have some rest. So the Jews made sure that there was a stop at every 7 days apart. One of those hostels or hotels or inn, whatever you want to call it, had a mikveh. To this day, they know it. I've seen pictures of it. And the most famous emperor of the Uzbeks is a person named Amir Timur, or Tamerlane, as he's known in the West. Tamerlane is buried in Samarkand on a street that contains fluted dome buildings all along the street where all the emperors of the Uzbeks are buried. These buildings look like the Taj Mahal, also an Uzbek temple for Shah Jahan's wife. And inside his tomb, which has beautiful interior inside with semi-precious stones all along the walls, are buried Amir Timur, his wife, his children, and the largest tomb there, covered by a 9-foot piece of solid jade, is his teacher. And his teacher was Jewish. And the Uzbek folklore is that he took the best of the religions of countries that he conquered, and he took from them their legal codes, and he got his civil code for the Uzbek Empire from Maimonides. Now, he's in the 16th century. The Rambam is in the 11th century. There's a statue in Samarkand, 30-foot high statue of two men. And the guides tell us that the first one is Amir Tamur, who's getting a book, and the second one is the Rambam, who's giving him the book. The book is the Code of Jewish Law. The picture I have of that statue, I'm sorry to say, it's in Israel, not here, so I can't show it to you. But my wife and I were there with the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, as well as being part of a diplomatic mission. And we are invited by the president of Uzbekistan, Karimov, to attend the dedication of the Museum of Jewish History in Uzbekistan in the capital city of Tashkent. And we're a part of this diplomatic mission. On the third floor, and I have pictures of the building on the outside, they wouldn't let me take pictures inside. But on the third floor, there are showcases. And one of the showcases says 16th century artifacts of Jews, and I'm looking at it, and it's got a talus with Psil Techeles. I'm standing there next to Rabbi Heshi Billet, the rabbi of the Youngers with me, and Harvey Blitz, who at that time was the president of the Orthodox Union. And they're both looking at me and they're saying, I can't be. First of all, where would they have a chila zone? It's not anywhere near here. It doesn't exist in the Aral Sea. So how do they maintain this? So it's a speculation on my part. Speculation is that maybe, just maybe, it had Psil Techeles and they kept it, but I would have no way of proving that because I didn't see it on a person or in clothing, and I certainly didn't hear about it, but they did with regard to the Jews of Yemen and the state of Israel. I'm going to finish with the discussion I had with Hagayan Harav Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg Psil. Rav Scheinberg was the Rosh Yeshiva, the creator of the Yeshiva Torah in Jerusalem. And he was famous for wearing 18 pair of tzitzis and 3 talesim all day underneath his cloak. He looked like he was a hunchback, but he was walking in the street and everybody recognized him. And we had a very close relationship. In fact, he was a Masada Kedusha when my son and daughter-in-law got married in Queens. And they also have a close relationship with his son, who's the current Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Simcha Scheinberg. And he asked the Rosh Yeshiva once, I walked into his office off the main lobby of the yeshiva, about certain things. And I asked him about another Mesorah that's been restored. From the time of the first printing press of Gutenberg, publishers printed out a siddur, a Jewish siddur, but the prayer of Aleinu was misprinted. That is, it was missing a pasuk, Shehem Yishtachevim Lehevel Arik, because the Christian censors forced the Jews to delete that sentence in the prayer. And this is the way every siddur printed for hundreds of years appeared. Until after World War II, when a Hebrew scholar named Philip Birnbaum, T.L. Birnbaum, created what is called the Birnbaum siddur. It was unique in the sense that all the Hebrew fonts were the same size, no more having a siddur with large Hebrew fonts and then small Hebrew fonts. All the fonts were the same size. There was a direct English translation page to page. And the first time it has Aleinu printed in that siddur, and I have a copy of one of the early editions. There's a footnote on the bottom that says there's a pasuk missing. The pasuk is Shehem Yishtachevim Lehevel Arik. It should be here. The fact that the Christian censors forced us to remove it, we should really put it back. And I asked the Rosh Yeshiva, should anyone today print a siddur that doesn't have the complete Aleinu? Does not, absolutely not. In fact, if you're aware of siddurim printed by Art Scroll or Karen Press in today's world, all the siddurim have a complete copy and version of Aleinu. So finding out that Rav Scheinberg said, we lost the Mesorah, we recovered it because for 5 centuries we didn't have it, now we've restored it. So this brought us into a discussion of Techeles. Since the sea snail, which was discussed by Rav Herzog in 1913, has now been determined to be genetically correct as the sort of the the guys both of Techeles and Argamon, and there's a Techeles Institute in Eretz Yisrael, which readily gives this out, and people have it, and more people are using it. So I asked the Rosh Yeshiva, what about the Mesorah of not having Techeles? And he was of the belief, and he gave a share on this. He was of the belief that perhaps in 50 years or so, Rove Yisrael, the majority of Jews, will be wearing Techeles. That Mesorah will disappear into the annals of history, and the Mesorah will be restored.